The house had been called haunted for decades, but Koda was digging at the floor like something beneath it was still waiting to be found. A metallic scrape trembled under the kitchen boards. Ethan froze, flashlight clenched in one hand, while Koda scratched harder at the same spot until dust jumped between the cracks. Then the floor answered with a hollow clang from somewhere deep below. What do you think Koda found? The first laugh came from somewhere behind Ethan Cole. He didn't turn around. On the projector screen at the front of the county meeting room stood a photograph of a 2-story house leaning into a Montana mountainside, as if the next hard winter might finally push it over. Half the porch had collapsed. Plywood covered 3 windows. Dead grass climbed through broken steps, and the chimney tilted just enough to make everyone wonder why it hadn't fallen. Parcel 117, the auction clerk said. Structure and approximately 14 acres. Opening bid, $1. Someone laughed again. That's the haunted place, a man whispered. $1's too much. A few people chuckled. Ethan kept his eyes on the screen. Under his chair, Koda lifted his head. The sable German shepherd had been asleep with his muzzle across Ethan's boot. Now his ears turned toward the voices behind them. Ethan lowered one hand and touched the thick fur between them. Easy. Koda settled again. Ethan understood the joke. He had spent enough years repairing cabins, fences, sheds, and forestry equipment to recognize a money pit when he saw one. The roof alone looked like trouble. The place probably had bad wiring, frozen pipes, rot, mice, and taxes waiting somewhere in the fine print. But Ethan had $587 in his checking account. His battered Ford was beginning to burn oil, and for most of the past 4 months, that truck had also been home. He had learned which forest pullouts weren't checked after midnight, which gas stations tolerated a man brushing his teeth in their restroom, which parking lots stayed quiet enough for Koda to sleep without raising his head every time headlights swept across the windshield. Ethan could sleep in a truck. Sleeping wasn't really the problem. Waking was. Sometimes his eyes opened before his mind did, and his right hand reached beside the seat for something that hadn't been there since Afghanistan. Then came the second or two when the dark windshield became a different darkness. Dust. Radio chatter. A hard white flash somewhere beyond a vehicle door. Then Montana returned. Usually Koda returned it first. A wet nose against his wrist. A warm body leaning into his shoulder. Any bids? The clerk asked. Silence. Ethan raised his number. The room went quiet for half a second. Then somebody snorted. $1 from bidder 43. The clerk scanned the room. Do I hear 2? Nothing. Going once. Ethan could feel people looking at him. Going twice. He rubbed the scar across his left thumb. Sold. $1. The gavel struck. Koda's ears jumped. Ethan let out a breath through his nose. Well, he murmured, guess we're homeowners. Koda looked up at him. For the first time that morning, Ethan smiled. By late afternoon, red pine had disappeared behind them. The paved road became gravel, then cracked logging road, then 2 muddy tire tracks climbing through lodgepole pine. Mountains rose on both sides, their upper slopes already dusted with early snow. Koda stood behind the front seats, nose working through the open window. Ethan drove slowly. Washout on the right. Loose rock ahead. Fresh deer tracks crossing the mud. He noticed such things automatically. He always had. The road climbed another half-mile before the trees opened. There it was. His dollar house. In person, it looked worse. Hell. Koda's tail thumped once. The house sat on a bench of land above a steep ravine. Gray siding had peeled almost white. The porch sagged toward one corner. Several roof shingles lay scattered across the yard, and one gutter hung vertically from the eave. Beyond the house, however, the land opened toward miles of dark timber and distant mountains. No traffic, no apartment walls, no motel television bleeding through plaster at 2 in the morning. No strangers. Ethan switched off the truck. Silence settled around them. Not complete silence. Wind moved through pine needles. Somewhere down the ravine, water crossed stone. The cooling engine ticked softly. But it was enough. Ethan rested both hands on the steering wheel. Koda pushed his head between the seats. "I know." The shepherd licked his ear. "Personal space." Another lick. Ethan opened the door. The front steps couldn't be trusted, so he entered through the side. The key fought him. He twisted harder, shoulder against the swollen door, until something inside surrendered with a crack, and the door swung inward. Cold, stale air rolled out. Koda tried to enter first. Ethan caught his collar. "Wait." The word changed the dog instantly. Ethan stepped inside alone. His eyes moved before his feet did. Doorway left. Kitchen ahead. Stairs right. Broken glass near the wall. Ceiling damage. Animal droppings. Rear exit visible through the kitchen. He checked the floor before putting weight on each questionable board. Then he cleared the downstairs rooms, checked the stairs, and inspected the second floor. There was no threat. There hadn't been any reason to expect one. Still, when he returned downstairs, his shoulders had loosened. Clear. Koda came inside. The shepherd immediately began cataloging the house in his own way. Nose against baseboards, furniture scars, door frames and gaps beneath cabinets. Ethan opened the curtains that still moved and removed plywood from one kitchen window. Evening light entered in a dusty amber beam. The place was wrecked. But it was his wreck. He carried in his sleeping bag, 2 blankets, a propane camp stove, water jugs, canned food, Koda's kibble, and an old toolbox. Dinner was beans heated in a dented saucepan. Koda received kibble with half a piece of jerky torn over it. Don't get accustomed to fine dining. Koda ate the jerky first. Darkness came quickly in the mountains. Ethan set his mattress pad on the living room floor near the wood stove. The chimney needed inspection before he trusted it, so he kept his jacket on instead. He lay back. Koda circled twice and dropped beside him. Ethan stared at the ceiling. There were water stains shaped like continents. One looked vaguely like Afghanistan. He turned his head. Don't. Wind strengthened outside. The old house creaked. Ethan listened without wanting to. Timber contracting. Branches scraping siding. A loose shutter, normal sounds. Then, bang! Ethan was on the floor before he knew he'd moved. Bang! His shoulder hit the kitchen cabinet. Bang! His hands were empty, but they had formed around an invisible weapon. For one terrible instant, the kitchen disappeared. White dust hung in hot air. Someone was shouting. A radio screamed beneath static. Then something heavy pressed against Ethan's leg. Koda. The shepherd leaned his entire shoulder into Ethan's knee. Ethan blinked. Kitchen. Montana. October. No rifle. No convoy. No contact. Just wind. He forced air slowly through his nose. I'm good. Koda remained against him. I'm good, buddy. Another metallic bang came from the roof. This time Ethan stayed where he was. He found the source outside 10 minutes later, a loose strip of roofing flashing, striking the chimney housing whenever the wind caught it. He secured it with wire. Problem solved. That was something he understood. Find the source. Fix what you can. Move on. By midnight, Ethan was asleep. At 1:47 a.m., his eyes opened. He didn't know why. The house was dark. Wind had weakened. Moonlight slipped through the kitchen window and laid a pale rectangle across the floor. Ethan reached down. His fingers touched an empty blanket. Koda? No response. He sat up. The shepherd stood in the kitchen, perfectly still. Koda. One ear rotated toward Ethan, but the dog didn't turn. Ethan got to his feet. Koda was staring down. Not toward the window, not toward the rear door. At the floor. Ethan crossed the room. What have you got? Koda lowered his muzzle until his nose almost touched the boards. His ears shifted forward. Ethan listened. Nothing. He crouched beside him. Mouse? Koda didn't react to the word. Then his head moved slightly to the left. Tracking. Ethan placed his palm against the floor. Cold wood. Dust. Nothing else. He almost stood. Then he heard it. Very faint. So faint that at first he thought it might be wind somewhere inside the walls. A vibration rose through the floor, metal against metal. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, stopped. Ethan looked at Koda. The shepherd was already staring back at him. Neither moved. 10 seconds passed. Then it came again. A thin metallic tremor from somewhere beneath the kitchen. Ethan slowly lowered his ear toward the floorboards. The sound stopped. The house became silent. And for the first time since he'd handed over $1 for the place everyone in Red Pine had laughed at, Ethan wondered exactly what he had bought. Morning made the mystery seem smaller. Sunlight pushed through the kitchen window and exposed warped boards, mouse droppings, cracked plaster, and 40 years of grime. Whatever Ethan had heard beneath the floor at 2 in the morning felt less threatening under a pale Montana sky. Koda disagreed. While Ethan heated coffee on the camp stove, the shepherd returned to the same section of floor. Sniff. Pause. 2 steps left. Sniff again. Koda. The dog looked up. Eat. Koda crossed to his bowl, but halfway there, his head turned back toward the kitchen. Ethan noticed. He noticed most things. That habit had survived Afghanistan better than some of the men he'd known. He spent the morning inspecting the property systematically. The roof leaked in 3 places. The upstairs bathroom had a cracked toilet. Turning the kitchen faucet produced a cough from somewhere inside the wall and nothing else. The electrical panel looked old enough to belong in a museum. Outside, Ethan walked the perimeter with Koda. He checked the foundation, drainage, roofline, windows, chimney, and the slope behind the house. On the north side, the mountain rose sharply into timber. To the south, the land dropped toward the ravine. He stopped periodically without thinking. Look. Listen. Move. At the rear corner, he crouched beside tracks in the mud. Deer. Raccoon. Something smaller. Nothing unusual. Still, he checked the tree line. You know we're not in an AO anymore, right? Koda sniffed a stump. Glad we had this conversation. By noon, Ethan had filled 3 notebook pages with repairs. Beside each item, he wrote an estimated cost. Roof patch, $120 if he did it himself. Waterline, unknown. Electrical, bad. Porch, lumber he didn't have. Chimney, inspect before using. When he added the numbers he did know, he stopped. He had $561 left after the auction fee and county paperwork. Ethan stared at the total, then crossed out half the list. Priorities, water, heat. 1 safe room. Everything else could wait. That was when an old pickup came grinding up the logging road. Koda heard it long before Ethan did. The shepherd stepped between Ethan and the road. Stay. The truck stopped near the broken porch. An elderly man climbed out carrying an armload of split firewood. He was tall but bent slightly through the shoulders, with a gray beard and a canvas coat polished smooth at the elbows. "You Cole?" Ethan remained beside the house. "Depends." The old man smiled. "Frank Mercer. I live about 3/4 of a mile downhill. Only fool close enough to qualify as your neighbor." Ethan glanced toward the wood. Frank followed his eyes. "Peace offering. For what?" "For not warning you before you bought the place." Ethan almost smiled. Frank carried the wood toward the porch. Koda moved with him. Frank stopped immediately. "Good-looking shepherd. He decides whether you are." Frank considered that. "Fair system." Koda sniffed his hand, then stepped aside. "Guess I've been approved." Together they carried the wood inside. Frank knew more about the house than Ethan expected. It had belonged to a man named Samuel Whitaker, a surveyor who had worked mining claims and timber boundaries throughout the mountains. Samuel had lived there alone for years. What happened to him? Old age, eventually. Frank placed another log beside the cold stove, but he started disappearing from town long before that. How long? Late 80s, maybe early 90s. Hard to remember. Frank's gaze traveled around the room. He used to be different, talkative, smart as hell. Then his field partner went missing up in the mountains. Ethan looked at him. Missing? Peter something. Dawson, I think. Winter survey trip. Search crews went out, but weather closed the high country. Never found him. Frank rubbed his palms together. After that, Samuel changed. How? Stopped trusting people. That landed closer to Ethan than he wanted it to. Frank continued. Folks started calling this place haunted. Kids dared each other to come up here. Hunters claimed they'd hear things underneath the house. Ethan's eyes shifted toward the kitchen. What kind of things? Groaning, scraping, metal noises. Frank smiled. Mountain town nonsense. Wind gets into an old building and people invent ghosts. Yeah. But Ethan wasn't smiling. Frank left before sunset after showing him how to shut off an old exterior water valve. Storm coming tomorrow night, he said. Maybe snow higher up. You need anything? My place is downhill. Green roof, I appreciate the wood. Don't thank me until you see how badly that stove smokes. Frank climbed into his truck. Before leaving, he lowered the window. One more thing. Ethan waited. Samuel hated people going under the house. Ethan's expression tightened. Why? Never said. Frank drove away. That evening, Ethan inspected the kitchen again. No basement door, no exterior cellar entrance. The foundation appeared solid from outside. He tapped several floorboards with the handle of a screwdriver. Solid. 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 Nothing remarkable. Koda watched him. You're turning me into an idiot. The shepherd yawned. Ethan spread his sleeping bag near the wood stove. He had cleaned the flue enough to risk a small fire, and warmth slowly replaced the mountain cold. For a few hours, the house almost felt comfortable. Ethan ate canned stew. Koda slept near the fire. Ethan found an old paperback in his truck and managed 12 pages before realizing he'd read the same paragraph 4 times. At 11:30, he put the book down. At midnight, he was still awake. At 12:40, he checked the front window. Nothing. At 1:15, sleep finally took him. A cracking sound ripped him awake. Ethan rolled from the sleeping bag and hit the floor. His heart slammed once, hard. Darkness, trees, Montana. But his mind supplied something else. A road outside Kandahar. A vehicle ahead of his. A flash. dust swallowing the windshield, someone yelling over the radio. Ethan pressed his palm against the floor. "Red pine," he whispered. The words came slowly. "Montana." His breathing settled. Another crack came from outside. A tree limb. Nothing more. Ethan sat against the wall. "Koda?" No movement beside him. He reached toward the blanket. Empty. Ethan was standing before he consciously decided to move. "Koda." A scratching sound answered from the kitchen. He grabbed his flashlight. The beam swept across the room. Koda stood over the same section of floor. Scratch. 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 "Koda." "Leave it." The dog kept digging. "Koda." Ethan crossed the room and caught his collar. Only then did he see blood. Damn it. One front paw had been scraped raw around a nail. It wasn't serious, but a thin red line marked the floor. Ethan immediately forgot the mystery. He sat down, pulled the small medical pouch from his gear, cleaned the abrasion, and checked between Koda's pads. "You don't get to hurt yourself over a mouse." Koda tried to pull his paw back. "Hold still." The shepherd licked Ethan's wrist. "I know. Terrible treatment." Ethan wrapped the paw lightly. When he finished, Koda immediately lowered his nose toward the boards again. "No." Koda stared at him. "Tomorrow." Ethan placed his hand on the floor where Koda had been scratching. Something felt different. Not movement. Air. He frowned. He moved his palm several inches. Nothing. Back again. There. A thread of cold air touched his fingers. Ethan lowered his face toward the floor. The house had gaps everywhere, but this was different. The air wasn't drifting sideways from an exterior wall. It was rising. From below. He took out his pocket knife and carefully scraped dirt from between two boards. Cold air whispered against his knuckles. Koda's ears rose. Ethan sat back on his heels. According to the county paperwork, the house had no basement. According to what he'd seen outside, there was no crawl space deep enough to explain it. Yet air was coming through the kitchen floor. Ethan reached for the flashlight. Koda leaned closer. "Tomorrow," Ethan said again. But this time he wasn't talking to the dog. He looked around the dark kitchen, remembering Frank's words. Samuel hated people going under the house. Ethan switched off the flashlight. For the rest of the night, Koda slept beside him. Ethan didn't sleep at all. At first light, Ethan made coffee strong enough to taste bitter even after it cooled. Then he emptied the kitchen. The folding table went into the living room. The camp stove followed. He stacked his water jugs beside the wall and moved anything breakable away from the section Koda had been scratching. Koda watched from the doorway, his bandaged paw held slightly off the floor. "You found it," Ethan said. "Now let me work." He knelt with a pry bar and examined the boards. Most of the kitchen floor was old pine, scarred and uneven, with square nails and gaps blackened by decades of dirt. But the boards near the pantry bothered him. Their wear looked similar, yet several had been cut at exactly the same length. 2 exactly. Ethan ran his thumb along one seam. Someone had removed these boards before. He worked slowly. The first plank groaned when he lifted it. Dust rose into the morning light. Beneath it was not the open joist space he expected. Concrete. Ethan removed another board. More concrete. By the 5th plank, he had exposed a rectangular slab roughly 4 feet wide. That wasn't on the county inspection. Koda limped closer. "Stay." The shepherd stopped. Ethan brushed away dirt with a shop broom. Near one edge of the slab, something curved appeared beneath the grime. Metal. He scraped around it. A steel ring had been recessed into the concrete and deliberately covered. Ethan hooked 2 fingers through it and pulled. Nothing. He tried harder. The slab didn't move. Too easy. Koda wandered toward the pantry. His nose worked along the bottom of an old cabinet. Ethan glanced over. What? Koda pushed his muzzle into the narrow gap beside it, then sneezed. Ethan almost laughed. You're supposed to be helping. Koda scratched once at the cabinet. Ethan's smile faded. He stood. The pantry cabinet looked original at first glance, but its rear panel was newer than the surrounding wood. Ethan removed 2 rusted screws, then another hidden beneath old paint. The panel came loose. Behind it ran a vertical iron rod. Ethan followed it downward with the flashlight. The rod disappeared into the floor. Upward, it connected to a crude lever assembly concealed behind the wall. Not electrical, mechanical. Someone had wanted it to keep working without power. Ethan stared at it for several seconds. Then he looked at the concrete slab. Koda, back. The shepherd retreated. Ethan pulled the lever. Nothing happened. He put more weight into it. Rust cracked. Somewhere below them, metal shifted. The sound was almost identical to what he'd heard during the night. Ethan froze. Then the slab moved half an inch. Cold air rushed through the opening. He released the lever. The slab stayed where it was. Ethan returned to the steel ring and pulled. This time the concrete section rose. Not easily. Hidden counterweights groaned somewhere inside the wall, but the slab lifted far enough for Ethan to see darkness beneath it. A staircase. He stood motionless. Koda gave a low whine. Yeah. Ethan opened the hatch fully. Concrete steps descended beneath the kitchen and disappeared beyond the reach of daylight. The smell rising from below was damp stone, rust, old wood, and air that had been trapped too long. Ethan took his flashlight, then stopped. Curiosity had gotten people hurt long before he ever wore a uniform. He retrieved a length of cord from the truck and tied the hatch open. A second flashlight went into his jacket pocket. He tested both before descending. He found an old candle, lit it, and lowered it several feet into the opening. The flame stayed steady. Not proof of safety, but better than walking blindly into a sealed space. Koda approached. No. The shepherd ignored him. Koda, stay. That worked. Ethan stepped onto the first stair. Concrete? Solid. Second. Third. Stop. Listen. Nothing. Move. He descended another 3 steps. The habits returned without invitation. Check corners. Don't silhouette yourself. Know your exit. Never assume an empty space is empty because it sounds empty. At the bottom, Ethan swept the flashlight slowly across the room. His first reaction was disappointment. No treasure, no dramatic secret. Just equipment. The chamber extended beneath much of the house. Its walls poured from rough concrete. Rusted shelving lined one side. Old electrical boxes hung from ceramic insulators. A workbench sat beneath layers of dust. Survey tripods leaned against a wall. There were coils of wire, broken lanterns, steel cabinets, and several wooden crates. Above him ran metal ventilation ducts. Wind moved through one. The duct flexed. A faint metallic vibration traveled through the room. Ethan stared at it. There was his ghost. He almost laughed. For decades, wind passing through old ventilation equipment had probably produced the sounds that frightened teenagers and fed stories in red pine. Haunted, he muttered. Koda barked from upstairs. You were scared of ductwork. Koda barked again. Fine. We were scared of ductwork. Ethan walked deeper into the chamber. The survey equipment made sense if Samuel Whitaker had worked out of the house. The hidden entrance was unusual, but perhaps Samuel had stored expensive instruments down here. Ethan opened one cabinet. Empty. Another contained ruined paper, swollen by moisture. The crates held nothing but corroded hardware. Whatever Samuel had once protected, it appeared long gone. Ethan felt foolish. A dollar house had given him exactly what a dollar bought. More repairs. He turned toward the stairs. Koda was standing halfway down them. Ethan stared. I said, "Stay." The shepherd descended another step. Apparently, we're renegotiating commands now. Koda reached the bottom and sniffed the room. His injured paw made his gait uneven, but his attention sharpened immediately. He ignored the shelves, ignored the crates, ignored Ethan. Then he crossed toward the far wall. Koda. The shepherd stopped in front of bare concrete. His nose moved along it. Then he scratched. Once. Ethan sighed. Not this again. Koda scratched higher. The sound was strange. Ethan tilted his head. Koda struck the wall again. Not the heavy, dead sound of solid concrete. Different. Ethan walked over. At first, he saw nothing unusual. The wall was stained with moisture. A thin mineral deposit ran down one corner. Dust gathered along the base. He shined the flashlight sideways across it. There. A vertical line. Faint. Too straight to be a crack. Ethan followed it upward. Then another line across the top. A rectangle. He stepped back. The entire section had been finished to resemble the surrounding wall. Koda sniffed near the bottom edge. Ethan knocked with his knuckles. Solid. He moved 6 inches. Knocked again. Still solid. Another foot. The sound changed. He knocked once more. A dull echo answered from the other side. Ethan's face tightened. He tried a lower section. Hollow. Koda looked up at him. The ventilation duct groaned overhead. This time, Ethan barely noticed. He ran his flashlight along the disguised seam until he found a patch of mortar, different in texture from everything around it. Someone hadn't simply built a basement. Someone had built another space beyond the basement, and then gone to considerable trouble to make sure nobody knew it existed. Ethan rested his palm against the cold wall. For years after Afghanistan, he'd distrusted closed doors. Now he owned one that had been disguised as concrete. He should have walked upstairs. He should have called Frank, maybe the county. Instead, Ethan crouched beside Koda. The shepherd's nose remained pointed toward the hidden section. What do you smell? Koda gave no answer, of course, but his ears remained forward. Ethan knocked once more. From somewhere beyond the wall came the faintest echo. Empty space. He looked toward the stairs, then back at the rectangle. The haunted house wasn't haunted. That part had an explanation now, but explanations were supposed to make a place less mysterious. This one had done the opposite. Because somebody had built a hidden room beneath Samuel Whitaker's house, and whatever had been important enough to seal behind concrete was still on the other side. Ethan didn't open it that day. That surprised even him. 10 years earlier, he might have attacked the problem immediately, driven by the need to know what was behind the wall. But experience had taught him that curiosity and urgency were not the same thing. The light was fading. He was tired. Koda had an injured paw. Those were 3 good reasons to wait. The next morning, Ethan returned with gloves, safety glasses, a pry bar, and the brightest work light he owned. Koda followed. Observation only. The shepherd ignored the lecture. Ethan examined the disguised section carefully. Near the bottom, beneath layers of mineral staining, he found a narrow metal edge. Not another concrete wall. A door. Someone had coated its surface to resemble the surrounding foundation. He worked along the seam until flakes of old mortar fell away. Rust appeared underneath. 3 hours later, Ethan exposed a steel door barely wide enough for a man carrying equipment. Its hinges were nearly frozen. He soaked them with penetrating oil, waited, then leaned into the handle. Nothing. Again. The metal groaned. On the third attempt, the seal broke with a sound like a rifle bolt magnified inside the underground chamber. Ethan stopped. Koda's ears snapped forward. A cold line of sweat formed beneath Ethan's collar. He knew where he was. Concrete basement, Montana. Koda beside him. He opened the door another foot. Air breathed from the darkness beyond. Ethan waited before entering. The room was perhaps 12 feet wide and 20 feet long. Shelves covered both walls. Waterproof cases were stacked on the floor. Some military-looking, but clearly commercial survey equipment from decades ago. He opened the nearest one. Paper. Hundreds of pages. That's disappointing. Koda sniffed the case. Ethan lifted another lid. More paper. The third contained cylindrical pieces of rock stored in divided trays, each labeled with faded handwriting. BR7, BR11, BR14. Dates followed. Another case held topographic maps covered in pencil lines, elevations, coordinates, and colored marks. There were old photographs, too. Men standing beside drilling equipment. Snow-covered ridges. A younger Samuel Whitaker in a heavy canvas jacket. Beside him stood another man Ethan assumed might be Peter Dawson. Both were smiling. Whatever had happened later hadn't happened yet. Ethan sat back on his heels. For one ridiculous moment the night before, he'd imagined stacks of old coins. Cash. Maybe something he could sell. Instead, he had inherited rocks and paperwork. Great. Koda looked at him. $1 house comes with a free geology collection. He picked up a core sample. Think anybody buys used rocks? Koda turned away. That's what I thought. Ethan began checking the room for water damage. That was when Koda changed. The shepherd stopped near the back corner. His body stiffened. Ethan noticed immediately. What? Koda stared upward. The ceiling above that corner showed heavy moisture staining. A crack ran through the concrete. Koda, come! The shepherd stepped toward Ethan, then stopped again. A few grains of grit fell. Ethan saw them strike Koda's back. Move. Koda suddenly lunged sideways. His shoulder struck Ethan hard enough to knock him off balance. Ethan fell backward. A section of deteriorated concrete broke loose from the ceiling. The sound filled the room. Dust exploded outward. Koda yelped. Koda! Ethan was moving before the dust settled. A broken slab had struck the floor where Ethan had been kneeling. Koda lay beside it. His rear leg was trapped beneath smaller debris. Ethan dropped to his knees. Easy. Easy. Koda tried to stand. No. Ethan cleared the loose pieces quickly, then lifted the largest chunk enough to free the dog's leg. Blood darkened the fur along Koda's thigh. Something inside Ethan went cold. Not fear. Procedure. His hands took over. Find the wound. Control bleeding. Check movement. Check breathing. Keep him still. He tore open the medical pouch. Pressure. Gauze wrap. Koda panted against the concrete floor. Stay with me. The words left Ethan before he could stop them. Suddenly the room smelled wrong. Not damp concrete. Diesel. Burned rubber. Hot dust. His hands were somewhere else. Another set of hands pressed against a torn uniform. A damaged vehicle leaned beside a road under a white Afghan sky. Someone was shouting for a medic. Ethan blinked. Blood covered his fingers. For half a second, he couldn't tell whose. Then something touched his wrist. Koda's nose. Ethan looked down. Brown eyes. Gray around the muzzle. Montana. Yeah. His voice came rough. I'm here. Koda licked his wrist once. Ethan swallowed. I'm here. The cut looked frightening but wasn't pumping heavily. Koda could move the leg, though he resisted putting weight on it. Ethan wrapped it firmly without over-tightening. We're done. He gathered Koda against his chest. At 70 pounds, the shepherd was awkward to carry up the stairs, but Ethan didn't put him down until they reached the living room. He cleaned the wound more thoroughly in daylight. The cut was deep enough to need professional care. Ethan looked at his bank balance on his phone, then at Koda. There wasn't a decision. An hour later, they were driving toward Red Pine. The veterinarian used several stitches to close the wound and prescribed antibiotics, rest, and strict limits on activity. The bill erased a painful piece of Ethan's remaining money. He paid it without complaint. On the drive home, Koda lay across the back seat wearing a protective bandage. You're officially the most expensive thing I own. Koda slept, house included. Back at the property, Ethan made him a bed near the stove. Only after Koda settled did Ethan return below. The hidden room looked different now. Not exciting, dangerous. He collected the papers that had scattered when the ceiling fell. One map, then another. A photograph. A field notebook. Ethan was stacking them when a phrase caught his attention. Black Ridge. He paused. Another map carried the same words. Black Ridge. East face. A third. Black Ridge. Core samples. Then he found a folded survey sheet inside a waterproof envelope. Across the top, Samuel had written something in thick black pencil. Black Ridge. Retain originals. Do not file. Ethan read it twice. Surveyors filed records. That was the point of records. He opened Samuel's field notebook. Several pages had been removed, not torn accidentally, cut cleanly near the binding. Ethan searched another case. More references to Black Ridge. Coordinates, assay numbers, handwritten corrections. On one official-looking survey map, a boundary line had been drawn in ink. Samuel had drawn another line beside it in pencil. The two did not match. Ethan stared at the discrepancy. He wasn't a geologist. He wasn't a lawyer. But he'd spent enough time around maps to know when somebody was documenting two different versions of the same ground. He carried several papers upstairs. Koda raised his head. Ethan sat beside him on the floor. Outside, afternoon light faded behind the ridge. He spread Samuel's maps across the boards. Black Ridge appeared again and again, sometimes circled, sometimes underlined, once followed by 3 question marks, and always the same instruction. Retain originals. Ethan looked toward the kitchen. The concealed stairs, the hidden basement, the disguised steel door. Samuel hadn't gone to all that trouble to hide worthless rocks. Koda shifted painfully and rested his muzzle across Ethan's boot. Ethan placed one hand on the dog's neck. Whatever he was hiding, he said quietly. I don't think he wanted anyone else to find it. Wind moved across the roof. The house answered with a low groan. This time, Ethan knew where the sound came from, but the explanation no longer comforted him, because the ghost had been nothing more than metal and wind. Samuel Whitaker's secret was real. For the next 4 nights, Ethan turned the living room into a field office. Samuel's maps covered the floor around the wood stove. Survey notebooks sat in careful stacks beside Ethan's mattress. Photographs were arranged by date on an old door he'd laid across 2 crates to make a table. Koda stayed close. The veterinarian had ordered rest, which Koda interpreted as a suggestion rather than a command. Every time Ethan moved toward the kitchen, the shepherd tried to follow. No. Koda took another step. You have stitches. Another step. Ethan pointed toward the blanket. Bed. Koda stared at him for several seconds, then limped back and dropped down with an offended sigh. Good talk. Ethan returned to the papers. He wasn't trained in geology, but maps were another matter. During his army years, bad information on a map could put a vehicle in the wrong valley or turn a simple movement into a long, dangerous night. You learned to compare what someone claimed was there with what the ground actually told you. Samuel's records didn't agree with each other. That bothered Ethan. The official survey copies showed Black Ridge as ordinary timber and rock. Samuel's private notebooks showed dozens of sampling points across the same area. BR4, BR9, BR17. Besides several were numbers Ethan didn't understand. There were also handwritten assay results, dates, and notes about mineral zones. One sentence had been boxed twice. Results do not match filed report. Ethan leaned closer. A second note appeared 3 pages later. Retested. Same. Then, keep originals off-site. Ethan looked toward the kitchen floor. Off-site, he murmured. Samuel's definition of off-site apparently meant under his own house behind 2 hidden doors. Koda's ears moved. Go back to sleep. Ethan searched the photographs. Samuel and Peter appeared in many of them, younger than Ethan had first realized. They stood beside drill rigs, snowmobiles, survey markers, and rock faces striped with pale mineral seams. In one picture, Peter held a core sample toward the camera, while Samuel grinned beside him. Whatever they'd found, they'd once been happy about it. The later photographs were different. Fewer smiles, more machinery. Company trucks appeared in the background. Some photographs had dates, but no descriptions. Then Peter disappeared from them entirely. Ethan sat back. The stove clicked softly as the iron cooled. Across the room, Koda was asleep with his injured legs stretched toward the warmth. Ethan looked at the maps again. There was enough here to make him curious, not enough to make him stupid. The next morning, he drove into Red Pine. He didn't bring a box of Samuel's records. He didn't tell Frank. He didn't ask questions around town. He took one rock, a 6-inch section of drill core labeled BR-17. At a forestry supply shop, Ethan asked the owner whether anyone nearby could identify old mining samples. The owner pointed him toward a woman examining soil testing equipment near the back. Rachel Bennett. Geologist. If she can't tell you, she'll at least tell you how much it'll cost to find out. The woman turned. She was somewhere in her late 30s, dressed in worn hiking boots and a faded canvas jacket. Her dark hair was tied behind her head, and there was dust on one knee. You selling rocks? She asked, trying to understand one. That usually costs more. Ethan handed her the sample. Her joking expression lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then she turned the core toward the window. Where did you get this? Old survey material. From around here? Maybe. Rachel glanced at him. That's an interesting answer. It's the one I've got. She took a small magnifier from her pocket. I'm not going to tell you this is worth anything from looking at one piece of core in a hardware store. I didn't ask that. Good. She studied it again. There are sulfides here, quartz veining, some alteration I'd want tested properly. What does that mean? It means somebody spent money drilling into rock for a reason. She rotated the sample. And depending on what the lab says, that reason might have been a very good one. Ethan's expression didn't change. Rachel noticed. You don't get excited easily, do you? Used to. She handed the sample back. If you have more cores with locations and assay records, don't lose them. And don't start telling people you've discovered a fortune. I haven't. Keep it that way. Ethan slipped the core into his jacket. How would I know whether the old results are real? Controlled retesting. Chain of custody. Compare multiple samples against the original logs. How much? Rachel named a figure. Ethan almost laughed. It was more than he could comfortably spend. Rachel read his face. I can start with a limited preliminary examination for less. But understand something. A promising sample isn't a mine. A mineral deposit isn't a bank account. There are access issues, permits, extraction costs, environmental restrictions, ownership questions. I understand. No, you understand that I'm saying words you don't like. That got half a smile from him. Rachel smiled back. Bring me 3 representative samples and copies of the relevant pages. Copies, not originals. Ethan's smile vanished. Why copies? Because if the originals matter, you shouldn't be carrying them around. Ethan studied her for a moment. Maybe Rachel had simply spent enough years around mining disputes to become cautious. Or maybe Samuel's notes were making Ethan suspicious of everyone. Tomorrow, he said. 3 days later, Rachel called. Ethan was repairing the rear door when his phone vibrated. Koda raised his head. Cole. Rachel didn't waste time. The old numbers aren't nonsense. Ethan stopped working. How sure? Sure enough to tell you we need proper laboratory work before I say anything stronger. He looked toward the mountains. Black Ridge was somewhere beyond the northern timber. What did you find? Mineralization consistent with the historical records you showed me. Potentially significant. How significant? A pause. Ethan, don't start spending money. I don't have any to spend. Then you're ahead of most people who think they've struck it rich. He waited. Rachel's voice became more serious. If those samples came from the coordinates in Samuel Whitaker's notebooks, somebody had reason to keep investigating Black Ridge. Ethan's grip tightened around the phone, and somebody didn't. Apparently. Why? That isn't a geology question. The call ended a minute later. Ethan remained beside the door. For weeks, his problems had been simple. Find shelter. Find work. Keep Koda fed. Keep himself moving. Now there was something beneath those mountains that Samuel Whitaker had considered important enough to hide decades of records behind concrete. Hope should have felt warm. Instead, it made Ethan uneasy. He had learned long ago that valuable things attracted attention. That evening, snow began falling lightly. Ethan drove up the logging road after picking up antibiotics for Koda and a few groceries. As the house appeared through the trees, Koda rose suddenly in the back seat. His ears went forward. What? The shepherd gave a low sound in his throat. Ethan stopped the truck 20 yards from the house. He didn't get out immediately. Look. Listen. The front door appeared closed. No lights. No movement. Ethan scanned the tree line. Nothing. Then he saw the ground. Fresh tire tracks crossed the thin snow. Not his. They came up the logging road, stopped near the rear side of the house, then turned around. Ethan switched off the engine. Koda was already watching the trees. Stay close. They got out. Ethan followed the tracks. The vehicle had never approached the front door. It had stopped behind the house where it couldn't easily be seen from the road. He crouched. The snow inside the tread marks hadn't begun to crust. Recent. Ethan looked at the rear window, then the door. No obvious damage. Koda moved ahead, nose low, until he reached the edge of the timber. There he stopped, rigid. Ethan's eyes traveled between the trees. The forest gave him nothing back. He called Koda quietly. The shepherd returned at once. Inside, Ethan checked every room. Nothing seemed disturbed. He reached the living room. Samuel's maps remained where he'd left them, but one sheet near the edge of the makeshift table was slightly crooked. Ethan stared at it. Maybe he'd left it that way. Maybe Koda had brushed against it. Maybe nothing had happened. He looked toward the kitchen. The hidden hatch remained closed. Ethan crossed the room and touched it. Then he noticed Koda. The shepherd wasn't looking at the floor anymore. He was looking toward the rear door. Ethan's fragile sense of possibility disappeared. Someone had driven miles up an abandoned logging road to a house everyone in Red Pine believed was worthless. They hadn't knocked. They hadn't left a note. They hadn't even approached from the front. And Ethan could think of only one thing that had changed since he bought the place. He had started asking questions about Black Ridge. 3 days passed without another vehicle. Ethan almost preferred that someone come back. Waiting was worse. He repaired the rear window latch, added screws to the weak door frame, and moved Samuel's original papers out of sight. He didn't create elaborate traps or pretend he was defending an outpost. He simply made the house harder to enter quietly. At night, he slept in short pieces. Koda slept differently, too. The shepherd's injured leg was improving, but whenever an engine echoed from the valley road, his head came up before Ethan heard anything. On Thursday morning, Koda was the first to announce the visitor. He stood beside the window, ears forward. A dark SUV climbed through the trees. Too clean. Too expensive. It stopped beside Ethan's battered Ford. A man stepped out wearing a charcoal coat and polished brown boots. Ethan watched from inside. The stranger didn't look first at the house. He looked toward the northern ridge, then at the boundaries of the property. Only after that did he approach the porch. Koda stood beside Ethan. Easy. 3 knocks. Ethan opened the door, but left the storm door closed. Mr. Cole? Who wants to know? The man smiled. Victor Shaw, Blackstone Resource Holdings. He produced a business card. Ethan read it without opening the door. Never heard of you. We hold interests in timber and mineral properties throughout this part of Montana. Shaw glanced at Koda. Beautiful dog. Koda didn't move. What can I do for you? Actually, I'm hoping we can do something for you. Ethan opened the storm door. Shaw stepped inside. His eyes traveled across the living room. Wood stove, mattress, toolbox, Samuel's old door being used as a table. Nothing about his expression changed, but Ethan recognized appraisal when he saw it. Shaw was measuring him. Poor, alone, desperate. Ethan had seen people make the same mistake before. You bought this place at the county auction, Shaw said. For $1. So I've heard. Everybody has. Shaw smiled politely. Our company has been consolidating small parcels in this area. Access corridors, watershed management, timber planning, that sort of thing. You want 14 acres? We want options. Shaw removed a folded document from his coat. We're prepared to offer $75,000. Ethan looked at him. The wood stove popped. Koda's ears twitched. $75,000. Cash purchase. Clean closing. We cover fees. Ethan glanced around the ruined room. The roof still leaked. His plumbing barely worked. His bank account had been reduced by Koda's veterinary bill and the first repairs. $75,000 could buy a small trailer somewhere. It could replace the Ford. It could pay debts. It could give him enough breathing room to stop measuring groceries against gasoline. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Shaw mistook silence for interest. You'd walk away with considerably more than your investment. My investment was $1. Exactly. Ethan picked up the document. The offer wasn't for the house alone. It included all associated easements, subsurface interests, and mineral rights. There it was. What do you want underneath it? Shaw's smile held. Nothing in particular. Then remove the mineral rights. A pause. Small, but real. That would complicate the transaction. Why? Our acquisitions are standardized. Ethan handed the paper back. No. Shaw didn't take it immediately. You haven't considered the number. I did. You're living in a condemned structure with what appears to be limited resources. Ethan's jaw tightened. Shaw softened his voice. I don't mean that disrespectfully. I'm offering you a way out. Ethan looked at his boots. No mud except near the soles. The man hadn't walked the acreage, hadn't inspected the foundation, hadn't asked about the roof, hadn't even looked upstairs. You drove all the way out here without seeing the property? Our people know the region. Which part? Shaw glanced toward the window. Black Ridge has been surveyed extensively. There's nothing left worth extracting there. We're mostly interested in consolidating land management. Silence. Ethan's face remained still. Koda looked between the two men. Shaw continued talking, but Ethan stopped hearing most of it. Black Ridge. Rachel knew the name. Laura didn't exist in this conversation yet. Frank had never used it. Ethan hadn't mentioned it at the supply shop, and he certainly hadn't told Victor Shaw. Who told you about Black Ridge? Shaw's expression changed by less than an inch. It's a local geographic designation, not on my county map. You'll find plenty of old names in historical records. Which records? Shaw folded the offer. I think we're getting distracted. No. Ethan opened the door. I think we're finally talking about why you're here. For the first time, warmth disappeared from Shaw's face. $75,000 is a generous offer, Mr. Cole. Then buy somebody else's haunted house. Shaw stepped onto the porch. At the SUV, he stopped and looked back. Old properties have old problems. Ethan said nothing. Sometimes the smartest thing a man can do is recognize when a problem belongs to somebody else. Then Shaw drove away. Ethan waited until the engine faded down the mountain. He looked at Koda. Yeah, Koda continued staring at the road. I didn't like him either. That afternoon, Ethan moved Samuel's most important notebooks into a weatherproof tool case. He photographed several pages with his phone. Then he called Rachel. Does Blackstone Resource Holdings mean anything to you? There was a pause. Yes. How much? Enough that I'm going to tell you not to discuss Samuel's samples over the phone. Ethan's eyes narrowed. That's reassuring. I'll explain when I know more. The call ended. Night came early. Ethan worked in the detached shed behind the house, repairing a chainsaw he'd been paid $50 to get running. Koda lay near the doorway, bandaged legs stretched forward. The first warning wasn't a bark. Koda's head simply rose. His nose turned toward the house. Then he stood. What? Koda's body stiffened. A second later, Ethan heard it. Glass. A faint crack. Koda launched. Koda! The shepherd crossed the yard despite his healing leg. Ethan followed. By the time he reached the rear corner, a dark figure came through the broken kitchen window. Koda barked and accelerated. The intruder ran, not toward the road, toward the trees. Ethan reached the edge of the yard and stopped. Koda didn't. Koda, here! The command cut through the dark. The shepherd slowed. Koda! He turned and came back. Ethan didn't chase. dense timber, unknown terrain. One visible person did not mean one person. He'd learned that lesson a long way from Montana. He stood listening. A branch snapped downhill. Then an engine started somewhere beyond the trees. Ethan watched through the darkness until the sound disappeared. Only then did he return to the house. The kitchen window had been forced. Mud marked the floor. Nothing obvious was missing. His tools remained. His wallet was still hidden where he'd left it. The old laptop sat untouched. Then Ethan opened the concealed hatch. He descended with Koda behind him. The basement appeared normal. He opened the hidden steel door. Stopped. Samuel's cases had been moved. One stood open, then another. Maps had been pulled out and shoved back carelessly. The intruder hadn't been searching for money. He'd been searching for information. Koda sniffed along the floor, then stopped at an empty space between two cases. Ethan remembered what had been there. A narrow box containing survey photographs. He checked. Gone. His anger arrived quietly. No shouting, no broken furniture. He simply stood in the hidden room with his hands hanging at his sides. Shaw's $75,000 offer had come that morning. Hours later, someone had broken into his house and searched Samuel Whitaker's records. Maybe the timing was coincidence. Ethan had stopped believing much in coincidence. He looked down at Koda. The shepherd was staring at the open cases. Someone already knew there was something beneath Black Ridge. Someone knew Samuel had documented it, and now they knew Ethan had found his records. For the first time since buying the house, Ethan wasn't wondering what Samuel Whitaker had hidden. He was wondering what someone might be willing to do to get it back. By sunrise, Ethan had photographed every disturbed box in the underground room. He didn't touch anything until he had pictures. Boot marks near the stairs, mud beneath the broken window, scratches on the steel door, the empty space where Samuel's photograph case had been. Old training had taught him that memory became unreliable once adrenaline entered the picture. So he documented first and thought second. Koda followed him upstairs, favoring his injured leg. "You did enough last night." The shepherd looked unconvinced. Ethan locked the basement hatch and called Laura Hayes. He'd found her name 2 days earlier while searching for attorneys who handled rural deeds and mineral rights. Her office was 40 miles away in a converted farmhouse outside Helena. When Ethan explained that someone had broken into his property after a company offered to buy it, Laura stopped him. "Don't tell me the rest over the phone." 3 hours later, Ethan sat across from her with Koda lying beside his chair. Laura was 46, practical, sharp-eyed, with reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. She spread copies of Ethan's deed across a scarred oak desk. "You paid $1 for this?" "That part seems to amuse everybody." "It doesn't amuse me." She traced one paragraph with her finger. "Because everybody may have been looking at the house instead of what came with it." Ethan leaned forward. Laura pulled an old county plat from another folder. The property wasn't simply 14 acres surrounding Samuel Whitaker's house. Attached to the deed was a narrow, irregular mineral parcel running north beneath timberland toward Black Ridge. "Old mineral rights get messy," Laura said. "Surface ownership can change while subsurface rights stay attached somewhere else. Companies spend years fighting over language like this. So I own Black Ridge?" "No." She looked directly at him. "You may control part of the mineral rights beneath part of it. That's a very different sentence, and until I verify the chain of title, don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Ethan appreciated that answer. It sounded real, not treasure, not $50 million. Paperwork, boundaries, arguments. Laura examined Victor Shaw's offer next. Her expression hardened. He wanted everything. "I noticed. Surface rights, mineral rights, access easements, future claims, for $75,000. If this parcel is meaningless, that's generous. And if it isn't?" Laura removed her glasses. Then somebody hoped you'd be grateful enough not to ask. Koda lifted his head when Ethan shifted in the chair. Laura noticed the bandage. What happened? Ceiling came down underground. And you're still living there? It's what I've got. Something in her face softened, but she didn't offer pity. Then let's make sure nobody takes it from you for the price of a used pickup. The next stop was Rachel Bennett's rented field office near Red Pine. 2 small core samples sat beneath bright lamps when Ethan entered. Rachel had labeled them by number rather than location. She didn't smile. I ran preliminary mineralogical work and sent portions to an independent lab. Ethan waited. Rachel rotated one sample beneath the light. Thin metallic veins crossed the gray stone. Samuel wasn't collecting random rocks. How good? Potentially very good. She pulled out several copied pages from Samuel's notebooks. The private assays are consistent across different sample points. His mapping suggests the mineralized structure continues through a significant portion of the ridge. Ethan stared at the numbers. They meant almost nothing to him. Translate. Rachel folded her arms. If Samuel's coordinates are accurate, if the deposit continues at depth, if the grades hold, if your mineral rights are valid, if extraction is technically possible, and if permitting doesn't kill the project. That's a lot of ifs. That's geology. She pointed toward the papers. But under a favorable scenario, the resource value connected to this ground could reach tens of millions. Ethan said nothing. Rachel hesitated. Possibly around 50 million in underlying resource value. 50 million. The number was too large to feel like money. Ethan thought instead about the $20 bills in his wallet. The veterinary invoice folded inside his glove compartment. The patched roof. His truck's failing transmission. Then he thought about Victor Shaw standing in his kitchen offering $75,000. Can I sell it for $50 million tomorrow? Rachel almost laughed. No. Good. She blinked. Good? Means I'm still dealing with something real. Rachel nodded slowly. Resource value isn't cash value. Development could cost millions. Ownership could be challenged. Environmental restrictions matter. Water matters. Roads matter. Markets matter. Ethan looked toward the window. Black Ridge stood beyond the trees, its upper slopes white with early snow. But somebody believes it's worth something. Yes, that was enough. That evening, Laura called. Her voice was different. I found Samuel Whitaker's partner. Found him? Found his name. Peter Dawson. 31 years old. Survey technician. Married. 1 son. Reported missing during a winter field expedition in 1988. The official account said Peter and Samuel had been working near Black Ridge when a storm moved in. Samuel returned alone. Peter didn't. Search crews found a damaged pack near an avalanche field, but no body, no confirmed remains, no final answer. What happened to Samuel? Laura asked. After Peter disappeared? That's where it gets strange. He stopped taking major survey contracts within months. Then companies began approaching him about mineral rights around Black Ridge. Which companies? Several names. Most are gone. Paper rustled over the phone. One was Continental Western Extraction. Ethan sat straighter. Never heard of it. You have indirectly. Corporate records show parts of Continental Western were eventually absorbed through mergers. Into Blackstone. A pause. Yes. Koda was lying near the stove. Ethan crossed the room and opened Samuel's photograph folder. The missing case had contained dozens of originals, but Ethan had kept several loose photographs upstairs after finding them scattered beneath the collapsed ceiling. Samuel and Peter appeared in one. Two younger men standing beside a survey tripod in deep snow. Samuel was thin, bearded, serious. Peter Dawson stood beside him with one glove raised against the sun. Koda got up. He approached Ethan and sniffed the photograph. Then his nose touched one corner. Careful. Koda touched it again. Ethan lowered the picture. Behind the two surveyors stood a truck. Only half of it was visible. An old company emblem had been painted across the door. A black mountain inside a white circle. Ethan stared. Something about it bothered him. He retrieved Victor Shaw's business card. Blackstone's modern logo was different. A clean black ridge beneath silver lettering. But the shape was there. The same mountain. The same broken line through the center. Ethan called Laura back. "I've got something." He photographed the old image and sent it. Silence followed. Then Laura spoke. "Don't leave those originals in the house." Ethan looked toward the windows. Darkness had swallowed the forest. "What aren't you telling me?" "I'm telling you we have a missing surveyor. Disputed mineral records. A predecessor company connected to Blackstone. And a man who showed up offering you $75,000 before you understood what you owned." Ethan's eyes moved toward Koda. The shepherd had turned away from the photograph. He was staring at the rear door. Laura continued. "I don't know what happened to Peter Dawson." Outside, somewhere beyond the porch light, snow slid softly from a pine branch. "But I'm starting to think Samuel Whitaker did." Ethan ended the call. He returned to the photograph. Peter Dawson was smiling. Behind him stood that company truck. And suddenly, Samuel's strange life made more sense. The hidden room. The private surveys. The records marked "Do Not File." The refusal to sell. The years alone in a house people eventually called haunted. Maybe Samuel hadn't hidden those documents because he was protecting a fortune. Maybe he'd hidden them because he'd been protecting evidence. And somewhere on Black Ridge, a man had gone into the mountains with him nearly 40 years ago and never come home. By the end of the week, Red Pine had stopped laughing. Ethan noticed it first at the hardware store, when he'd bought roofing tar there after the auction. Two men near the register had joked that he should charge admission to the haunted house. Now those same men lowered their voices when he walked past. One finally asked, "Heard there's minerals up on your place?" Ethan kept moving. Heard wrong. But rumors traveled through mountain towns faster than weather. Someone had seen Rachel's truck near his property. Someone knew Laura Hayes had requested old mineral records. Someone at the county office had apparently mentioned Black Ridge. By Saturday, the story had grown from an old survey dispute into buried gold, then rare minerals, then $50 million sitting beneath Ethan's kitchen. His phone began ringing. A man Ethan had worked with for 3 weeks on a forestry crew suddenly remembered they were good buddies. A distant cousin he hadn't spoken to in 11 years sent a message asking how life was treating him. 2 real estate agents left business cards on his truck. The same people who had laughed when Ethan spent $1 now spoke as though he'd won a lottery. He hated it. Not because they were wrong about the possibility, because Rachel's words wouldn't leave him. Possibly around $50 million in underlying resource value. At night, Ethan would look at the patched ceiling and think about what even one fraction of that could mean. A reliable truck. A roof that didn't leak. No more choosing which bill could wait. Then his eyes would drift toward Samuel's photograph. Peter Dawson smiling beside the survey tripod. And the number 50 million stopped sounding like freedom. It sounded like a question. Koda's stitches came out Monday. The veterinarian warned Ethan that the shepherd still needed another week without hard running. Try explaining that to him. The vet smiled. "You're the owner." Ethan looked at Koda. Koda looked back. "That's debatable," Outside, Koda climbed carefully into the truck. Ethan lifted his hindquarters before the dog could jump. For 1 second, Ethan felt the shepherd's full weight in his arms. 7 years old. Not young anymore. The realization stayed with him longer than he expected. On the drive home, a pickup appeared behind them. Dark blue, no front plate. It remained there through 3 turns. Ethan checked the mirror without moving his head much. The old part of his brain began measuring distance automatically. Vehicle. Occupants unknown. Following interval. Possible turnoff ahead. He hated how natural it felt. He turned onto an old forest road instead of heading home. The pickup continued behind him. Ethan's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Koda stood in the passenger seat. Down. Koda lowered himself. A quarter-mile later, Ethan slowed near a logging turnout. The pickup passed. One man inside. Baseball cap. Gray beard. The driver never looked over. 5 seconds later, Ethan realized he had been holding his breath. He pulled over. His hands remained on the wheel. The forest was silent. No Afghanistan. No convoy. No contact. Just Montana. He looked at Koda. The shepherd's nose touched his elbow. I'm fine. The lie sounded foolish with nobody else around. That evening, Frank Mercer came carrying a pot of elk stew. You look like something the cat dragged behind a snowplow. Good to see you too. Frank set the pot on the stove. You hear what people are saying? Apparently I'm rich. Frank grunted. You don't look rich. That's because I have $38 until Friday. Frank laughed, but Ethan didn't. The old man's expression changed. Be careful with Black Ridge. You keep saying things like that. Because Samuel used to look the way you're looking now. Ethan turned. How? Like every car on the road had his name written on it. Frank lowered himself into a chair. After Peter Dawson vanished, Samuel changed. Put better locks on this place. Stopped drinking at the tavern. Started checking behind him whenever he came into town. Did he ever tell you why? No. Frank looked toward the floor. But once, maybe 25 years ago, I asked why he didn't sell this place. Some company had offered him enough to move somewhere warm. What did he say? Frank's eyes returned to Ethan. He said, Some land costs more after you sell it. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Later, after Frank left, Ethan copied Samuel's most important documents onto an encrypted drive and prepared another package for Laura. It should have made him feel safer. Instead, he checked the front lock twice, then the rear, then the windows. At 1:17 a.m., he woke because Koda was standing beside the mattress. The dog wasn't barking. His ears pointed toward the road. Ethan listened. Nothing. Then, an engine. Slow. It climbed toward the house. Headlights passed through the trees and painted pale bars across the bedroom wall. Ethan was already standing. His heart struck hard against his ribs. He moved to the window without stepping directly in front of it. The vehicle stopped somewhere beyond the bend. Engine running. Then silence. A minute passed. 2. The engine moved away. Ethan remained at the window long after the sound disappeared. By morning, he found tire marks near the lower gate. Maybe hunters had turned around. Maybe teenagers wanted to see the haunted house. Maybe somebody was checking whether he was home. He wrote the tire pattern in his notebook anyway. That afternoon, he caught himself checking the rear window again. Then the basement hatch. Then his truck. The behavior bothered him more than the tire tracks. He knew what hypervigilance could become. A useful reflex could turn into a cage. He had watched men come home from Afghanistan and spend years sitting where they could see every restaurant entrance. He had done it himself. Now Black Ridge was giving his old instincts new reasons to stay awake. The snow came Wednesday evening. By 9, nearly 4 inches covered the yard. Ethan sat beside the stove repairing a torn work glove while Koda slept nearby. At 10:06, the shepherd's eyes opened. His head rose. Ethan heard nothing. Koda stood. He moved toward the kitchen. Koda? The shepherd stopped above the basement hatch. A low sound came from his chest. Ethan set down the glove. The hatch was locked. He knew because he'd checked it less than an hour earlier. Koda sniffed along the edge. Then Ethan saw them. Fresh scratches around the metal latch. His body went still. He unlocked the hatch. The air below smelled of damp concrete and cold earth. Ethan switched on the basement lights. Nothing moved. He descended slowly. Koda followed despite Ethan's quiet command to stay. The hidden room door was partly open. Ethan had left it closed. Inside, Samuel's boxes had been disturbed again. He counted them. Once, then twice. One was missing. A long waterproof survey case containing original coordinate sheets from the northern section of Black Ridge. Ethan turned toward the steel door. Something white lay on the floor. A folded piece of paper. He picked it up. 4 words had been written in black marker. Sell the land. Walk away. Ethan read it again. Koda stood beside him, ears forward. The paper began to crumple in Ethan's fist. For months, he'd been tired. For years, if he was truthful. Tired of drifting. Tired of waking at sounds nobody else noticed. Tired of explaining gaps in his work history. Tired of pretending that sleeping in his truck had been a choice. The $1 house had been ridiculous. Broken. Cold. Possibly worthless. But it was his. Someone had entered it twice. Someone had searched his things. Now someone had left instructions. Ethan flattened the note carefully. Anger could wait. Evidence came first. He photographed it where he'd found it, then slipped it into a clean plastic sleeve. Upstairs, he called Laura. She answered on the 3rd ring. Someone came back. Her voice sharpened. Are you safe? For now. What happened? They took one of Samuel's survey cases. Silence. And left a message. Ethan looked toward the dark kitchen window. What does it say? He read the 4 words. Laura was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ethan, listen carefully. This is no longer a property negotiation. He looked down. Koda had positioned himself between Ethan and the rear door. I know. Call the sheriff. Tonight. And I'm sending copies of everything we have to another secure location. Ethan watched snow fall beyond the glass. Only days earlier, $50 million had sounded impossible. Then it had sounded like hope. Now, standing in the kitchen of a house nobody had wanted, Ethan understood something Samuel Whitaker may have learned decades before. The value beneath Black Ridge wasn't making him safer. It was putting a target on the only home he had. And whoever had written that note wasn't asking anymore. The sheriff's deputy photographed the broken latch, took the note, examined the tracks outside, and promised extra patrols when weather allowed. Weather stopped allowing much by Friday afternoon. A storm rolled over Black Ridge so quickly, the mountains disappeared behind gray. Snow drove sideways through the pines. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 3 hours, and the county issued a warning against unnecessary travel. At 4:20, the power failed. The house went silent. Ethan stood beside the kitchen window while Koda watched the darkening road. Isolation. Bad road. No power. Limited visibility. The combination bothered him. He didn't know whether Victor Shaw was connected to the break-ins, And he wasn't going to invent certainty because it made the world easier to understand. But he knew vulnerability when he saw it. Ethan lit 2 lanterns and kept them away from the windows. He charged his phone from the truck, filled containers with water before the pressure failed, brought firewood inside and moved Samuel's remaining records into waterproof cases. Then he photographed every page he hadn't already copied. The files went to Laura. A second set went to Rachel. At 5:13, he called Frank. "If you don't hear from me by 8 tomorrow morning, call the sheriff." Frank was silent. "Ethan, what are you expecting?" "Nothing." "That's not an answer. It means I don't know, huh?" Another pause. "I'll call at 8:01. Appreciate it. And don't go playing soldier up there." Ethan looked toward Koda. "I haven't been a soldier in a long time." Frank's voice softened. "Parts of you have." The line went dead. By 7, snow had buried Ethan's tire tracks. Koda refused dinner. He stood near the rear door, nose lifted. Ethan watched him. "You smell something?" Koda moved toward the kitchen, then back to the door. Restless. At 7:46, headlights appeared below the property. Ethan's stomach tightened. The vehicle climbed slowly through the storm. Not a county truck, not Frank's pickup. A black SUV. Victor Shaw. Ethan didn't open the door when Shaw knocked. "What do you want?" Shaw stood on the porch with snow collecting across his shoulders. "We need to talk tomorrow. There may not be a tomorrow for this deal." "Then I guess we're done." Shaw looked toward the trees. 2 men stood near the SUV. Ethan hadn't seen them get out. One was broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas jacket. The other remained partly obscured by blowing snow. 3 men. Ethan. Koda. No immediate help. Ethan's breathing slowed. He hated the familiar mental arithmetic. Doors, windows, distance, hands, terrain. He wasn't back in an AO. He knew that. But his body had already begun arranging the room. Shaw raised both hands. "I came to prevent this from becoming uglier than it needs to be." "Interesting way to do that." "Let me inside." 10 minutes. Ethan should have refused. Instead, he made a calculation. Outside, he couldn't control where the other 2 men moved. Inside, he could keep them visible. "Only you." Shaw glanced toward the SUV, then nodded. But when Ethan opened the door, the broad man followed. "I said only you. He's my driver. Drivers usually stay with the vehicle." Shaw gave a tired smile. "Ethan, nobody is here to hurt you." Koda stepped forward. His growl was almost too low to hear. Ethan put one hand against the shepherd's chest. "Back." Koda obeyed. Barely. Shaw entered. The second man remained outside. That bothered Ethan most. Shaw removed his gloves. "Your attorney has started making inquiries that could create problems for several parties." "Good. You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then explain it." Black Ridge isn't $50 million sitting in a vault. Development costs, environmental reviews, litigation. I already know. That surprised him. Shaw recovered quickly. "Then you understand 75,000 was generous, for land you say is worthless." Shaw's jaw tightened. "I can increase it." "No." 150, no. 250,000. Ethan stared at him. The number hung between them. 6 months earlier, Ethan had slept in his truck behind a closed sawmill because the parking lot had lights and nobody bothered him there. Now a man was offering $250,000 for a house purchased for one. Ethan should have felt tempted. Instead, he thought about Peter Dawson. What happened to Samuel's partner? Shaw went still. There. Ethan saw it. Not guilt. Recognition. Who? Peter Dawson. The broad man near the door shifted his weight. Ethan noticed. Shaw looked toward him, a glance lasting less than a second. Enough. Old history, Shaw said. You know the name. I've reviewed historical files. Before or after somebody stole Samuel's survey case. Shaw's polite expression vanished. This is your last reasonable opportunity. Koda's growl deepened. The man by the door took one step toward Ethan. Call your dog off. He is off. The man moved again. Ethan didn't retreat. Stop. Shaw raised a hand. Everyone calm down. Outside, wind slammed something against the shed. Bang! For a fraction of a second, Ethan wasn't in the kitchen. Dust. A hard white flash. A vehicle door torn open somewhere outside Kandahar. His right hand moved toward a weapon that wasn't there. The room returned. Too late. The broad man had closed the distance. His hand grabbed Ethan's jacket. Koda launched. The shepherd struck the man's side. The man staggered and kicked backward. His boot caught Koda hard beneath the ribs. Koda hit the floor with a yelp Ethan had never heard from him before. Something inside Ethan narrowed. Not rage. Training. He broke the man's grip, turned his body, created space, and moved toward the side door instead of deeper into the room. Koda, out! Shaw shouted something. The broad man recovered. Then a new sound came from beneath them. Metal clattering. A hiss. Ethan smelled fuel. During the struggle, something had shifted near the basement utility line. The old generator system. Then came a dull whump below the floor. Orange light flashed through the seams around the basement hatch. Fire! Smoke pushed upward almost immediately. Shaw backed toward the front door. His driver stumbled after him. Ethan grabbed the extinguisher from beside the stove, opened the basement hatch only enough to look, and was hit by a wave of smoke. Too much. The underground ventilation ducts were carrying it through the structure. Out! Ethan shouted. Nobody argued. They spilled into the snow. Cold air struck Ethan's face. Shaw's second man ran from the side of the house toward the SUV. Ethan turned. Koda! The shepherd emerged behind him, limping badly. Relief lasted 1 second. A cracking sound came from below. Part of the basement ceiling shifted. Ethan backed farther from the house. Shaw's men climbed into the SUV. Shaw stood beside the open passenger door. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ethan stared at him through the snow. What was supposed to happen? Shaw didn't answer. The SUV reversed down the access road and vanished into the storm. Ethan reached for his phone. No signal. He looked at Koda. The shepherd wasn't there. Koda? Nothing. Ethan turned toward the house. Koda! A bark came from somewhere inside. Then another. Muffled. Below him. Ethan's blood went cold. He ran to the kitchen entrance. Smoke rolled from the doorway. Koda! A shape moved briefly behind the haze, then disappeared toward the open basement hatch. No! Ethan crossed the threshold. Koda, here! No response. Then he understood. The shepherd had gone back down. The basement. The hidden room. Orange light flickered beneath the floor. Smoke thickened across the ceiling. And somewhere under the burning house, Koda barked once, then went silent. Ethan stepped toward the doorway. Heat rolled across his face. For half a second, the orange light inside the kitchen became something else. A burning vehicle. Dust hanging in Afghan sunlight. A radio screaming over another man's voice. Someone shouting that there was still one soldier inside. Ethan froze. His lungs stopped working properly. The snow beneath his boots vanished from his mind. He could smell diesel and scorched rubber even though neither belonged to this night. Then, beneath the crackle of fire, came one sound. A bark. Weak. Underground. Montana returned. "Koda!" Ethan pulled his coat over his mouth and entered. Smoke had dropped lower. He stayed beneath it, one hand following the wall because visibility disappeared within several feet. The lantern was useless now. The beam reflected against smoke and turned everything white. The basement hatch stood open. Heat rose through it. Ethan stopped at the top of the stairs. Every instinct told him not to descend. He had no breathing equipment, no fire crew, no backup. Going into a burning underground structure was exactly the kind of decision people didn't come back from. Then something scraped below. Ethan went down. "Koda!" No answer. He descended slowly, testing each step before putting his weight on it. The underground chamber looked nothing like it had 20 minutes earlier. Smoke moved through Samuel's old ventilation ducts in thick streams. Flames crawled along insulation near the generator compartment, throwing broken orange light across the concrete. Ethan kept low. 3 steps. Stop. Listen. Move. Not because he was pretending this was Afghanistan, because panic wasted oxygen. At the bottom, he heard coughing, then claws scraping concrete. "Koda!" A faint whine answered. Left side. Hidden room. Ethan moved toward it. A section of shelving had collapsed across the entrance. He pushed one twisted metal frame aside. "Koda!" The shepherd was on the other side, alive. Koda lay partly beneath a fallen shelf, his sable coat gray with dust. One front paw was tucked against his chest. The bandage around his rear leg had torn open, and a dark stain spread through the fur beneath it. But his eyes were open. They locked onto Ethan. "Hey." Ethan dropped beside him. "I'm here." Koda tried to rise. "Don't." Ethan lifted the shelf enough to free the dog's hindquarters. Koda crawled forward, then stopped. "Come on." The shepherd turned his head toward the rear wall. "No." Koda scratched weakly at debris. "We're leaving." Ethan hooked an arm beneath his chest. Koda resisted. Even hurt, even surrounded by smoke, the stubborn animal pulled toward something beneath the collapsed shelving. Ethan followed his gaze. A metal case. Not one of the waterproof survey boxes Ethan knew. This one was smaller, dark green, almost completely buried. A chain ran from its handle into the wall. "Koda." The dog pawed toward it again. Ethan stared at him. "You came back for that?" Another crack sounded overhead. Dust fell from the ceiling. Decision made. Forget it. He lifted Koda. The shepherd weighed nearly 80 pounds, and injured weight felt heavier. Ethan got him several feet toward the stairs before Koda twisted hard enough that Ethan nearly dropped him. The dog looked back. Ethan followed his eyes again. The case, then the wall. Not the case, the chain. Something about the way it disappeared through the concrete didn't make sense. Ethan lowered Koda against the wall. 30 seconds. He returned to the case. The chain wasn't anchored directly into concrete. It passed through a narrow steel slot hidden behind a broken panel. Ethan pulled. Nothing. He cleared debris with both hands. Behind it was a recessed compartment. Another crack. Closer. Ethan grabbed the small pry bar lying near Samuel's old workbench and forced it behind the panel. Once. Twice. The metal bent. Inside was a locking mechanism connected to the chain. He struck it. The chain dropped free. That was enough. Ethan dragged the case across the floor. Koda tried standing. His front paw folded. Ethan saw the damage now. Burned pads, not catastrophic, but bad. "You're done walking." He shoved the case toward the stairs, then lifted Koda again. Smoke burned Ethan's eyes. His chest tightened. Halfway up, the world narrowed. Not again. A voice from 15 years earlier surfaced in his head. "Cole, leave it!" He remembered turning toward a burning vehicle. Remembered somebody holding him back. Remembered a young soldier named Mason Reed, who had joked that morning about pancakes when they got back to the Elza. They never ate those pancakes. For years, Ethan had replayed what he might have done differently. Run sooner, moved faster, ignored the order, done something, anything. His foot slipped. Koda's body shifted in his arms. Ethan hit the railing. The present snapped back. No. He wasn't losing this one to a memory. "Koda, stay with me." The shepherd's muzzle touched his jaw. Ethan climbed. One step. Another. Another. At the top, he kicked the case through the kitchen doorway first, then carried Koda outside. Cold air hit them like water. Ethan stumbled into the snow and lowered the dog carefully. Behind them came a deep, grinding roar. Part of the basement ceiling collapsed. The kitchen floor dropped several inches. Flames flashed through the opening. Ethan crawled farther into the yard and pulled Koda with him. For a long moment, neither moved. Snow landed on Koda's coat and melted. Ethan placed 2 fingers against the dog's neck. Pulse. Fast. But there. "Good boy." His voice broke. Koda's tail moved once against the snow. Ethan laughed, or tried to. It came out as something between a cough and a sob. He pressed his forehead against Koda's. "You stupid, stubborn dog." The shepherd licked soot from his chin. Ethan stayed there until headlights appeared below the property. Frank had seen the glow from across the valley and called emergency services before fighting his way up the road in his truck. Volunteer firefighters arrived behind him. Nobody asked Ethan why he was sitting in the snow without gloves, holding an injured German shepherd like a child. The house could wait. The fire could wait. Black Ridge could wait. The metal case could wait. At the emergency veterinary clinic in Helena, a veterinarian examined Koda while Ethan stood beneath fluorescent lights wearing smoke-blackened clothes. Bruised ribs. Burned front pads. The old rear leg wound reopened. No internal bleeding they could detect. No major fractures. "He's lucky," the veterinarian said. Ethan stared through the treatment room glass. "No." The veterinarian looked at him. "I am." Koda needed stitches again. Medication. Observation through the night. The receptionist offered Ethan directions to a nearby motel. He shook his head. "I'll stay. We have chairs." "That's fine." Near 3 a.m., they let him sit beside Koda. The shepherd was groggy from medication, one front paw wrapped thickly, his rear leg bandaged again. Ethan lowered himself onto the floor. There were chairs. He didn't use them. He leaned against the wall beside Koda's kennel and rested one hand through the open gate. Koda shifted until his head settled across Ethan's wrist. Outside, snow covered the parking lot. For the first time in weeks, Ethan didn't think about Victor Shaw. He didn't think about mineral rights. He didn't think about Samuel Whitaker. He didn't think about $50 million. He watched Koda breathe. In, out, in, out. That was enough. Sometime before dawn, Ethan finally slept. When he woke, Laura Hayes was standing in the hallway holding 2 coffees. Her face was pale. "Koda? Alive." Laura closed her eyes briefly. Thank God. Ethan accepted the coffee. Then he noticed what she carried beneath her other arm. The dark green metal case. Frank had recovered it from the snow before firefighters secured the property. The case was scorched along one edge. The lock remained intact. Laura looked down at it. The sheriff photographed it before releasing it to me. He wants to know what's inside. So do I. Laura sat beside Ethan. I found something else overnight. What? Samuel Whitaker didn't buy that house. Ethan waited. He inherited it shortly after Peter Dawson disappeared. From who? His father. Laura lowered her voice. But the mineral parcel attached to it was transferred separately. Samuel filed that transfer himself 3 weeks after Peter vanished. Ethan looked at the case. Why? I don't know. Wow. Koda stirred. His eyes opened. Even drugged and exhausted, he lifted his head toward the metal box. Ethan stared at him. The dog hadn't gone back into the basement because of money. He hadn't known what $50 million meant. He had heard something, smelled something, recognized something Ethan had missed, and nearly died refusing to leave it behind. Laura placed her hand on the scorched lid. Whatever Samuel Whitaker was protecting all those years, the lock gave a faint metallic click beneath her fingers. I think your dog just pulled it out of the fire. They didn't open the case at the clinic. Laura insisted on waiting until the sheriff had documented the chain of custody, and Ethan was awake enough to understand whatever they found. By afternoon, Koda had been cleared to go home, though home was temporarily Frank Mercer's spare room. The fire department had saved most of the house, but the kitchen floor and underground chamber were unsafe. Koda moved slowly. His front paw was wrapped thickly. His rear leg carried fresh stitches. Each time he tried to put too much weight on it, Ethan's hand appeared beneath his chest. Not today. Koda looked irritated by the help. That almost made Ethan smile. The meeting happened in Laura's office the following morning. Rachel Bennett was there. So was a county investigator. The green case rested on Laura's table. Its exterior was blackened by smoke. Inside, everything was dry. No gold, no money, no treasure, only paper. Laura lifted the first bundle carefully. Original deeds, hand-drawn boundary maps, survey notebooks, assay reports, photographs, several sealed envelopes. At the bottom sat a small cassette recorder wrapped in oilcloth beside 3 tapes. Rachel picked up one of Samuel's maps. This is better than what we had. She spread it flat. Survey lines crossed black ridge in red pencil. Drill locations had been marked beside handwritten assay results. These coordinates matched the samples Ethan brought me. Laura examined the deeds, and these may establish why Samuel refused to file the later county maps. Ethan sat quietly. Koda lay beneath the table with his head across Ethan's boot. The first cassette contained mostly field notes, wind, numbers, Samuel's voice calling distances. Another man answered occasionally. Peter Dawson. Hearing him changed the room. Until then, Peter had existed as photographs and a missing person report. Now he was laughing through static. Sam, if this snow gets any deeper, you're carrying the tripod. Samuel answered, You complain more than my wife. Peter laughed again. Then the tape ended. Nobody spoke. Laura inserted the second cassette. This recording was different. Samuel sounded older. Tired. If anyone hears this, I suppose I finally ran out of time. Ethan looked toward Laura. She let the tape continue. Samuel described discrepancies discovered during the 1988 Black Ridge survey. The company funding portions of the work had been purchasing mineral interests from local families. According to Samuel, some landowners had been shown incomplete geological information. Peter discovered that the private field results suggested far greater mineral potential than the reports being used during negotiations. Rachel's jaw tightened. They were buying from people who didn't know what they had. Samuel's recording continued. Peter wanted to report it. Samuel wanted more evidence first. They argued. Then Peter arranged to meet representatives of Continental Western near an old winter access road. Samuel followed later. The recording stopped. Laura turned the cassette over. Samuel's voice returned. Quieter. I found Peter's pack below the cut. I found blood on the tailgate of the company truck. They told me there had been an accident. Ethan's hand stopped on Koda's neck. Samuel never claimed to have witnessed Peter's death. That mattered. He described only what he had seen. A damaged pack. Signs of a confrontation. A truck leaving during worsening weather. And Peter never returning. The official search later focused on an avalanche chute miles away. Samuel had spent years trying to prove that the avalanche story was wrong. The documents in the case showed how. Letters, vehicle records, private survey results, copies of payments, photographs of Continental Western trucks near locations. Company officials later claimed their employees had never visited. Then Laura found a signed statement. It came from a former Continental Western field employee named Harold Vance. The statement had been notarized in 1996. Vance wrote that Peter Dawson confronted two supervisors over altered mineral reports. An argument became physical near the winter road. Peter fell down a steep rock cut during the struggle. The men panicked. Instead of reporting what had happened, they moved Peter and staged evidence near an avalanche area, hoping winter would erase what remained. Ethan stared at the page. So Peter wasn't murdered for $50 million. Laura shook her head carefully. We don't know enough to use that word. But according to this statement, people concealed what happened after a confrontation tied directly to the mineral dispute. That somehow made it worse. Not a grand conspiracy. Not some movie villain executing a perfect plan, a bad decision. Then another. Then decades of silence built on top of it. Samuel had known, but one frightened employee's statement and a collection of private records hadn't been enough to force the truth into daylight. So Samuel protected everything, including the land. Rachel examined another map. This parcel Ethan owns sits over one of the most promising portions Samuel identified. Laura nodded. And the original deeds in this case strengthen the chain of title considerably. How considerably? Ethan asked. Laura looked at him. Enough that Blackstone is going to have a very difficult time pretending your mineral interest doesn't exist. Rachel leaned back. With these original assays and the preliminary work we've already done, the $50 million estimate doesn't look less plausible. Ethan glanced down at his coat. Smoke stains still marked one sleeve. 50 million. Again, the number felt absurd. Then Laura opened the final envelope. Across the front, Samuel had written, "To whoever owns the house after me." Inside was one handwritten letter. Ethan read it himself. Samuel wrote about Peter's wife, his son. The years of wondering whether speaking sooner could have changed anything. Then he wrote about Black Ridge. Companies had approached him repeatedly. Some offered money. Later offers became enormous. Samuel refused them all. Not because the minerals were worthless, because Peter had discovered something beyond the mineral deposit. The ridge fed springs that joined a creek supplying farms and wildlife habitat throughout the lower valley. Large-scale extraction could require roads, blasting, waste storage, and water management across terrain Samuel considered too fragile for careless development. Peter had written about it in his field notes. One sentence had been underlined twice. If they take the whole ridge, the valley pays for it. Samuel's final paragraph was shorter. Peter died trying to stop men from hiding the truth for money. I will not honor him by taking their money myself. If this land passes to someone else, Let that person decide with better judgment than I had when Peter still needed me. Ethan read the final sentence again. When Peter still needed me. His throat tightened. Suddenly he understood Samuel in a way he hadn't expected. Different mountain. Different decade. Different failure. But the same terrible habit of surviving one moment and spending years prosecuting yourself for it afterward. Ethan remembered Mason Reed, the burning vehicle, the order to stay back. All those nights asking whether another 5 seconds of courage would have changed the outcome. Koda shifted beneath the table. Ethan lowered his hand. The shepherd pressed his muzzle into Ethan's palm. Rachel quietly gathered the maps. Laura gave him time. Finally, Ethan asked, "If the rights hold, what happens?" "Legally? Yes. You may have something extremely valuable. And Blackstone? After the break-in, the threat, the fire, and what Samuel preserved, Shaw has larger problems than negotiating with you." Ethan looked toward the window. Morning sunlight lay across snow-covered fields. He should have felt victorious. The men at the auction had laughed. Victor Shaw had tried to buy him out. People had treated the house like a joke. And now Ethan Cole, who had arrived with less than $600 and nowhere permanent to sleep, might control mineral rights tied to something worth around $50 million. Instead, he looked at Koda's bandaged paw. "What would happen if I sold everything?" Rachel answered cautiously. "A buyer would still need permits and approvals. Nothing happens overnight." But if full development eventually happened? She understood the real question. Parts of Black Ridge could change permanently. Ethan looked at Samuel's letter. There it was. The cruelest kind of fortune. Not money buried beneath a floor. A choice. One that had already cost Peter Dawson his future. One that had consumed Samuel Whitaker's past. Laura folded her hands. "You don't have to decide today." Ethan stared at the final line of Samuel's letter. No. His fingers moved slowly through Koda's fur. The dog had nearly died retrieving the truth from beneath that house. Ethan wasn't going to reduce that truth to a number. For the first time, he understood why Samuel had hidden everything instead of selling. The $50 million secret beneath Black Ridge wasn't simply what the mountain might be worth. It was the price someone would eventually have to decide not to take. The decision took almost a year. Not because Ethan couldn't make up his mind. Because mountains, unlike rumors, moved slowly. Investigators used Samuel's records to reopen questions surrounding Peter Dawson's disappearance. Harold Vance's statement led them back to the old winter road, where modern searches uncovered evidence consistent with Samuel's account. Peter's surviving family finally received something they had been denied for decades. An answer. Victor Shaw faced investigation over the break-ins and the confrontation at Ethan's house. Blackstone publicly distanced itself from him, while attorneys fought over old corporate records and predecessor liabilities. Ethan stayed out of the television interviews. When reporters parked near the lower road, he let Laura speak. He had spent enough years surrounded by noise. He didn't need more. The mineral rights dispute took longer. Surveyors returned to Black Ridge. Environmental teams sampled streams. Rachel walked miles of steep country with younger geologists carrying equipment Samuel Whitaker would have recognized. The numbers held. Not perfectly. Geology rarely cooperated that neatly. But enough. One development proposal placed the potential value of Ethan's mineral interest near the number that had followed him for months. $50 million, on paper, under the right conditions, with years of work. The offer that eventually reached Laura's desk could have made Ethan wealthy beyond anything he understood. Full access, long-term extraction rights, road construction, development across a broad portion of Black Ridge. Ethan read the proposal at Frank's kitchen table. Koda slept beneath it. The shepherd's fur had grown back over his injured thigh, but a thin scar remained. His burned paw had healed. On cold mornings, however, he carried his rear leg with a slight hitch. Ethan noticed every time. Frank poured coffee. So? Ethan closed the folder. They want most of it. And? No. Frank smiled into his cup. That was quick. I've had a year. Ethan didn't reject every proposal. That surprised people. He wasn't trying to turn Black Ridge into a monument nobody could touch. Families in Red Pine needed jobs. The county needed revenue. Ethan needed enough financial security that one broken transmission wouldn't put him back in his truck. So he worked with Laura, Rachel, state officials, conservation groups, and eventually a different resource company willing to accept tighter conditions. The upper watershed remained protected. No development near Peter's old survey zone. No road through the most fragile drainage. Limited rights elsewhere could be explored under environmental review, with water monitoring and restoration requirements built into the agreements. It wasn't the largest check Ethan could have taken. That became the point. When Laura showed him the final documents, she tapped the signature line. You understand you could make substantially more by selling outright? Yes. You're sure? Ethan looked down at Koda. Samuel spent half his life trying to answer that question. He signed. Peter Dawson's family received formal recognition in the historical investigation and access to Samuel's preserved records. At their request, a small marker was placed near the lower Black Ridge Trail. It didn't mention $50 million. It read, Peter Dawson. He found the truth and refused to look away. Ethan stood before it on a clear September morning. Beside him was Peter's son, Daniel, now older than his father had been when he disappeared. Daniel touched the marker once. My mother waited 34 years. Ethan had no useful answer, so he didn't offer one. Koda sat between them. After a while, Daniel lowered his hand and scratched behind the shepherd's ear. I hear you're the one who found half this mess. Koda leaned into him. Ethan almost smiled. Most of it. The money Ethan eventually received changed his life, just not in the way Red Pine expected. He repaired the house. The porch stopped sagging. The wiring was replaced. The kitchen received a new floor over a reinforced foundation. The hidden chamber was stabilized, but Ethan kept part of Samuel's old workspace intact. Then he bought several acres farther down the property and built 3 modest cabins. Frank thought they were rentals. They weren't. The first veteran arrived the following spring. His name was Ray, former Marine. He spoke little. He slept less. For 3 days he barely left his cabin except to walk the tree line before sunrise. Ethan never asked what happened to him. On the 4th morning he handed Ray an axe. Woodpile's getting low. Ray stared at it. That your version of therapy? No. Ethan picked up another axe. It's my version of kneading wood. They worked until noon. Another veteran came 2 weeks later. Then another. Some repaired trails. Some fished. Some helped Frank replace fence posts. Some sat on the porch for hours and said almost nothing. Nobody was required to explain why a dropped tool made them turn too quickly. Nobody asked why certain men chose chairs facing the door. Koda became the one creature on the property who seemed to know who needed company without being told. He would wander between cabins in the morning, choose a porch, and lie down, sometimes beside Ethan, sometimes not. Ethan learned not to take it personally. 2 years after the auction, the old haunted house looked almost ordinary. That pleased him. One November evening, a storm came down from Black Ridge. Rain struck the windows. Wind moved through the lodgepole pines. Ethan sat beside the stove with coffee, while Koda slept nearby, muzzle beginning to gray. Thunder cracked directly over the ridge. The sound hit hard. Ethan's hand stopped halfway to the cup. His shoulders tightened. For an instant, another landscape pressed against the edges of the room. Dust, heat, metal, Mason Reed. Ethan felt the old reflex waiting. Get low, find cover, locate the threat. Koda raised his head. Brown eyes found Ethan. Neither moved. Ethan slowly lowered the cup to the table. The thunder rolled farther down the valley. Koda's head returned to his paws. Ethan breathed out. That was all. No miracle. No sudden cure. Just one storm his body didn't get to control. Later, while Ethan washed his cup, Koda suddenly stood. His ears lifted. Then he trotted toward the kitchen. Ethan watched him. No. Koda stopped over the repaired floor. Oh, come on. The shepherd scratched once. Ethan stared at the boards. For 2 years, that sound had meant trouble. Hidden stairs. Samuel's chamber. Black Ridge. Peter Dawson. Fire. $50 million. Koda scratched again. Ethan grabbed a flashlight. You have got to be kidding me. He crouched beside the table. Koda shoved his nose underneath. Something scraped across the floor. Ethan's pulse rose despite himself. Then Koda backed out triumphantly. A dried strip of elk meat hung from his mouth. Ethan stared. Koda chewed. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Then he laughed. Not the short laugh he used when people asked uncomfortable questions. Not the tired laugh that meant leave me alone. A real one. He sank onto the kitchen floor. Koda's tail hammered against the boards. You nearly killed me for that? The tail beat harder. Ethan rested against the cabinet, still laughing. Outside, thunder moved beyond Black Ridge. The house didn't answer. No groaning beneath the floor. No mysterious vibration. No footsteps. Just rain on the repaired roof and an old German shepherd chewing stolen meat beside the stove. The house wasn't haunted anymore. Maybe it never had been. Months of fear had turned into years of purpose. Samuel's secret had given Peter Dawson his name back. The mountain had given Ethan enough security to stop running without requiring him to destroy what another man had died trying to protect. But none of that was what Ethan remembered most when he thought about the dollar he'd spent. He remembered Koda beneath the auction house window. He remembered the laughter when nobody else bid. He remembered waking in an empty house and hearing metal beneath the floor. He remembered carrying 80 pounds of injured dog through smoke because leaving him behind had never been an option. And he remembered something quieter. The first night Ray had slept 6 straight hours in one of the cabins. The morning another veteran laughed while Koda stole his glove. Frank drinking coffee on the repaired porch. Peter's son standing beside his father's marker. A life built slowly from something everyone else had dismissed as worthless. Ethan reached over and rubbed the gray fur beneath Koda's chin. Best dollar I ever spent. Koda swallowed the last piece of meat. Then he sniffed beneath the table for another. Ethan shook his head. Somewhere beyond the windows, Black Ridge disappeared behind clouds. It was still worth a fortune. Maybe 50 million. Maybe more someday. Ethan no longer needed to know. The $1 hadn't bought him a $50 million secret. It had bought him a broken house in the mountains. A reason to stay. A truth worth protecting. And finally, a place where he could stop running from everything he'd carried home. If you believe Koda was the real hero of this story, comment 1 below. If Ethan's journey meant something to you, subscribe and stay with us, because another unforgettable story of loyalty, courage, and second chances is waiting for you in the next video.